the trajectory goes from 0 to 100. So in fact, that's the transition period for haha. And you notice that it's graduated, it's graded, that it's a statistical display, it's quantitative, in other words. And if you look at another place down the road a piece, you can see that again the trajectory is straight up, and eventually we trust is going to end up at 100%. So all these regions show age grading, show a regular generational change. And I just want to use this simple example, which I use in my classes too when I'm talking about the apparent time hypothesis and age grading. I want to use this as an example, just to point out the kind of astute sociolinguistic mind that Takashi Shibata brought to social uses of language in cases like this. And in this, again, case of age grading, as I said, and they are developmental stages in a person's life, and children learn to say ha-ha as they mature in generation after generation. So it's the kind of change that, to the best of my knowledge, no one in the history of linguistics had noticed before. As Shibata says, and he just his conclusion is this, they use childish honorifics until about the age of 14 or 15, right? You can't give an age to it because, of course, it's graded. In other words, the age when people are still referred to as girls and boys. Wonderful conclusion, wonderful piece of work. And so I just wanted to pause a minute and think about what is involved, what the implications are in this, and to show you this. So this is a study of change in progress. 1959, years before it was regular practice anywhere in the world. It's a quantitative study long before, well, not long before, but several years before quantitative studies were very common. It has age correlations implicit of course, in the elementary, junior, and senior high. It has regional differences, which are, I presume, covert class distinctions, the uptown and downtown Shibuya, and Ginza, wherever it was. And also contextual style, that is written versus spoken responses because of Taka Suzuki's work as well, so that you get this contrast in sort of in style if you are speaking directly to someone or if you're getting someone to answer a questionnaire. And of course, as I've pointed out ad nauseum by now, it's an example of age-graded change long before we knew much about those. So I just want to, again, make the point. The hallmarks of sociolinguistics, of variationist linguistics, of Lebovian sociolinguistics, are all here in Takashi Shibata's 1959 work. It is quantitative linguistics, where linguistics at the time was generally qualitative, almost exclusively qualitative. And Shibata anticipated the three major theoretical innovations. So when sociolinguistics became an international discipline in the middle of the 1960s, there were three aspects that came into linguistic analysis that had not been there before in any kind of regular way. And one of them, of course, is the identification of linguistic variance with social factors. And in fact, William Leboff's earlier work was greeted with some scorn by a certain cast of linguists because it used things like age and sex as variables, and they thought that was a silly notion, something that really we shouldn't have to put up with. The identification of linguistic variance correlating with social factors, so we get age and regional differences here. The incorporation of style as an independent variable. Contextual style is implicit in the study and in many other studies that come out. So it depends who you speak to and what the circumstances are, what the context is, those sorts of things, which have not been part of linguistic analysis on a regular basis anyway before this. And of course, the apparent time apprehension of changes in progress, which is probably the single most auspicious theoretical innovation of sociolinguistics. It has, as I mentioned earlier, revolutionized large swatches of how we do linguistics. And the apparent time apprehension of changes in progress is all here in Takashi Shibata's little study. And what I want you to notice is that Professor Shibata's practices predate Western variationist linguistics by more than a decade. And I'm not much interested in Western variationist linguistics as an entity, but what's important about Western variationist linguistics is that it fostered an international movement, as Takashi Shibata's work did not, and as other people who I'm going to mention in a few minutes, their work did not. So the difference is not in some kind of inherent superiority of William Leboff's work, but the difference is that William Leboff's work caught a wave and became an international practice. So the effective beginning of that international movement is the early 1960s, and Leboff presented his first research report to the Linguistic Society of America, which is probably the largest professional organization of linguists then and now. And that was in 1962, and he published a wonderful paper that almost everybody in here will know and will have his or her students reading, called Social Motivation and the Sound Change in 1963. And that is the effective beginning. From that point, from that small starting point, things then burgeoned and went in various directions. But what about Takashi Shibata? He was not included, in a sense, in the movement that sprang out of this. But I want you to notice that he belongs to a distinguished group of individualists. He was one of several who recognized the need for a socially motivated, socially realistic linguistics, and worked out its dimensions, sometimes against great opposition. It appears that Shibata did not have much opposition, but there was opposition in lots of circles for other people who were involved. And I'm just going to show you now a couple of people who are Shibata's mates in some way, his kindred spirits, right? So here's the first of them all. The first variationist of them all was Varro, who wrote a treatise on language in 116, well, 3,000 years ago, whatever that is, and it survives as a fragment. And Varro is unique, as far as I've been able to discover, among the classical writers on language, in that he recognized the vernacular, he recognized speech, he recognized social interaction and the way it affects speech. And one of his statements, his work exists in a fragment, so we aren't getting all of it by any means, but consuetudo loquendi est in motu. That means the vernacular is always in motion, which is I think it's the kind of, we should have it as a poster on our walls, all of it. Put it up there. It is, as some of you will recognize, it's the epigraph of my sociolinguistic theory book. And he recognized that language is always changing, that speech is the vehicle of language change, that never stops for a moment, right? And so that's Varro, who did not found, he was a polymath, he was also a mathematician and various other sorts of things, so he was a dabbler, he was not a language person specifically. But what he wrote about language is socially realistic in a way that no other classical author is. And here's another one. This is Louis Gauchat, and you can almost tell by the formal appearance that he's Swiss. No, just kidding. He was a Swiss scholar and the professor of philology at the University of Zurich, and also I guess he's best known among Romance scholars for compiling a dictionary of Swiss lexical items in each of the regions. But we revere him we sociolinguists revere him because in 1905 he published a study of a village named Charmy in the Alps, in the Swiss Alps. And he happened to go there with Madame Gauchat several times on holidays, and what he noticed was that the people in this isolated alpine village spoke different from one another. That is, if you were the village doctor, you didn't sound like the village blacksmith, and if you were the village, and so on. And the girls in school sounded different from the boys in school. And so he noticed all of these kinds of things, and so he set about to study the variation within the village, which at the time was sacrilege of a kind, right? The dialectologists firmly believed that an isolated village like Charmy should have one mode of speech. He set about to prove that that was not so, that it was false, and among many other things in his wonderful article, which has now been translated by a student of mine named Sarah Cummins and included in a 100-page supplement to Historiographica Linguistica with an introductory article by me on Louis Gauchat as the proto-variationist. He says, variation in pronunciation among members of a single speech community has not been studied systematically despite its potential contribution to our understanding of language change. And that could have been written in the 1960s by Leboeuf, Weinberg, and Herzog. It's very much in the spirit of the manifesto, the 1968 manifesto that all of us sociolinguists subscribe to. His article is a magnificent piece of work. If you have trouble finding Historiographica Linguistica, please send me email and I'll send you a PDF of the 100-page piece on Gauchat. Very wonderful, interesting, important man who said that he hoped his work in Charmy would inspire others to look into this, but he was quashed, really. I mean, the intellectual current of the day was for dialect geography. His great contemporary was Gilles Héron at the Sorbonne, who was compiling the Atlas Linguistique de France with the help of Edmond Edmond. And that was the intellectual current of the day, and it was completely opposed to the kind of work that Gauchat was promoting. And so he himself, Gauchat, never went back and did any more of that sort of work. His work was always sort of dialect geography kind of work. He was uncomfortable going against the current of the day, but he left behind this wonderful piece of work that anticipates, again, the three hallmarks of sociolinguistics. And here's Jan Czekanowski. I've written less about him than others, but there is a short piece that I've written. And he's either Polish or Ukrainian. It's hard to tell because the border kept changing when he was growing up. But he was an anthropologist, a social anthropologist, and a curator of many anthropology museums, and then the chair of the anthropology department in Poland at the end of his days. And what he did was he noticed that the way you can make sense of dialect differences, one way of making sense of them, is to take a list of linguistic features and look at two dialects and see in what respects they share those features and in what respects they don't share those features. But he didn't just stop there. He used a kind of bivariate analysis, a correlation coefficient, and he statistically showed the similarities and differences between dialect groups. And he did that first for the Slavic dialects and then for Indo-European dialects, and left behind a